So far, we've covered some concepts around lists, list types, tables, and then even nesting images, tables, and lists inside of lists. We're going to create a new file here. I'm going to save it as forms.html. So you can probably imagine what this lesson is going to be about. Forms are both one of the most difficult parts of HTML and also one of the most amazing and feature-rich parts of HTML. So I've created our HTML document here. Let's create a head, and then underneath that, create a body. And then inside the head, I'm going to add a title and call it Intro to Forms. I'm calling it Intro to Forms because forms are easy to learn but difficult to master in HTML. In order to truly master forms, we need the help of JavaScript, but we're not going to get into that just yet. So form basics as the h1 tag. And as you might imagine, the tag for creating a form is form. But inside it, we need to populate the form with certain elements. The element that we're going to be using is an input. So as soon as I typed input, you can see we have this input box here, and as we start typing inside the input, it'll show up. The inputs have various types, and you can specify the type as an attribute. And as soon as I typed type, brackets started giving me suggestions on what type of input I want. You can see there's quite a few types of inputs. There's a button, a checkbox, a color, date, time, email, file. Many of these look very similar but behave slightly differently. So let's try a button. And then inside the button, we'll give it a value of submit. The value attribute specifies the initial value of an input. If we had a text input, so I'm going to copy this, and above it, above this submit button, I'm going to, this time, the type I'm going to change to text. So now we have a text with a value of submit. Remember, value specifies the initial value of an input. There's also another attribute called placeholder. And a placeholder is what shows up when there's no text in the input. So right now, our text input here is empty, but I can specify a placeholder and set that equal to search. So then by default, it'll give some level of instruction to users on what they should be doing here. Instead of submit here, I'm going to change the value of the button to search because submit has a different context inside of HTML. So now, with this placeholder, as soon as I type something, the search will disappear. In fact, as soon as I type a single letter, the search will disappear because it is a placeholder. What about submitting a form? Well, as I mentioned before, that's a little bit advanced. We could get a little bit of a preview. We could just get a little bit of a taste on what submitting a form is actually like. We will need to use maybe one line of JavaScript to really make sure that the form is actually submitting, but we can probably tackle that. So let's take this button and have that be a submit button. So right now the input type is button. I'm going to change that to submit. And you can see it's still a button, but this time it's going to behave slightly differently because now that we have a submit property inside of our form, we can add what's called an event handler to our form. And let's have that event handler be on submit, meaning this is what's going to be called when the form is submitted. An event handler in HTML is a global attribute that you can add to almost any element. And it's especially common to see event handlers inside of forms. Think of an event handler as having the ability to detect certain events that a user creates. So for example, when I click on search, I've actually caused the browser to fire off an event because I created an action that has some sort of an effect on the way that maybe the HTML page looks, maybe the web page looks. So I have fired off an event as a user by clicking on this search button. By submitting a form, I create an event. Buttons can have events. And it turns out HTML also has a button attribute. And I can just create a regular button. When I press this button, it doesn't really do anything. It would be great if it was just magical and automatically, searched and returned whatever I wanted to search for. And it would be great if I could just type food in here and it would just deliver awesome food to my door. Like, that would be great, but unfortunately, the web doesn't work that way. What HTML does provide us is the ability to work with events. And these events are things like onClick, things like onSubmit with a form. These are event properties that we can add and attach, and then those will be passed into our attributes by the browser. Well, you might be wondering what's going to be passed in, because right now this onSubmit field is pretty empty. So this is where JavaScript comes in, because HTML and CSS aren't really good at handling the logic behind how things work. So HTML, again, think of it like the word processor. So you're writing default text and plain text and things like that. And CSS is what gives it better styling, gives it color, gives it all these different things. But that still doesn't really handle the business logic. And that's where JavaScript comes in. But for now, just know that there are these global event attributes that come built into HTML that we can assign to almost any element. And for now, we're just going to write one line of JavaScript and say console.log, and then open parentheses and close parentheses. Then inside our parentheses, we're just going to use a single quote, and inside the two single quotes, we'll say form is being submitted. So this is the one line of JavaScript we're going to write inside of our onSubmit event handler. Okay, so now instead of regular button, let's call this useless button, because it really is not really going to do anything. It's a little bit useless, but now we're going to make it slightly less useless. We're going to say console.log, and then single quotes, useless button was clicked. So now we've attached two events and one line of JavaScript as a way to handle that event. Okay, so now let's click this button a few times, the useless button, and then let's search for something. Let's type food and then search. Notice that after I pressed search, the form was submitted and the value of food was reset. Every time I press search, the value of food is reset. So what that's doing is that's actually reloading the page after the form is submitted. So we don't really want to reload the page. First, let's press the useless button a few times. Don't submit anything in the form. And then I'm going to do something that's going to break live preview. So just stay with me, and I'm going to inspect. And then in Chrome, when I right-click the page and go to inspect, that opened up this menu right here. And now in this menu, we're currently under the Elements tab. Go over to the Console tab, and then I clicked the useless button a few times and it said the useless button was clicked. But the thing is, the default behavior of a form in HTML resets the value. So when I press search, so it doesn't really do anything, because the default behavior of a form is to reload the page every time the form is submitted. So we're going to change our code slightly, and instead of having this be a console log form is being submitted, we're going to make it an alert. This will create a pop-up on our page that'll say form is being submitted. So now restart live preview here, and now we have our form again with our useless button. So I'm going to click the useless button a few times. Now I'm going to type something into the form and say search, and now we see an alert that shows form is being submitted. But notice that right after the alert, the form was reset and the input field is now empty. That is some default form behavior that comes built into HTML. And again, I want to emphasize that if you don't fully understand this just yet, it's completely okay. In order to truly master forms in HTML, you do need a fairly in-depth level of JavaScript. Luckily, even if you don't know JavaScript, there are certain tools that you can use to submit essential forms like a mailing list using a software like MailChimp. So I'm here inside MailChimp, and when you select a list in MailChimp, you can select an embedded form. And when you select an embedded form, it shows you the preview of the form that you want. Subscribe to our mailing list, email address, first name, last name with a subscribe button. I can just copy this code, pure HTML code, go back into our intro to forms, and underneath, at the very end, I could just paste this code in, and it'll show me the same form that I saw here on MailChimp. So there are certain tools that give you HTML code that you can include that'll create a form that'll automatically be added and manage your mailing list for you. These services are sometimes necessary because managing forms on your own can get pretty complex. And look at how many lines of code MailChimp has to create in order to create just this form. So it's no easy task to create a form in HTML, but there are services that will help you. That's everything about forms. Now we'll cover a few more features about HTML and making HTML more accessible.